Thank you, Harry. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss this very important topic. The defense of the homeland is the most basic premise of American grand strategy, and it has been since before this country was founded. If you read the Bill of Particulars in the Declaration of Independence, you'll see one of the complaints was that the king was not protecting American citizens from attacks on our own land. This has been a consistent theme since our founding and the Revolutionary War in American strategic discussions, whether it's the sacking of Washington and the burning of the White House during the War of 1812, the premise of the Monroe Doctrine that we wouldn't let powers from the old world have a salient into the new world from which they could threaten the homeland. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved in part by the U.S. making a commitment that we would not attack Cuba again, absent the deployment of offensive weapons capable of striking our homeland. And after the 9/11 attacks, the world saw the kind of response that the American people demand when our citizens are attacked on our own soil. That's also one reason why we have all those forward deployed bases in places like Europe and the Middle East and East Asia on the Eurasian rimland. Yes, it's to assure our allies and to help defend them, but more than anything, it's forward defense for the United States and our citizens and our territory, so that if any war is going to be fought, it's going to be fought as an away game on our enemy's turf, not a home game on our turf. That's why missile defense is a must-have technology for our military, not a nice-to-have one. It's only becoming more so in the future because our rivals are continuing to advance their ballistic and cruise missile technology. I divide the threats that we face into short-term and long-term. Short-term threats, obviously, is North Korea. Longer-term threats are countries like Iran, Russia, and China as they develop and deploy more advanced systems. As a preview, I'd say there are 4 things we need to do to counteract these threats. First, and most simply, is to increase our defense spending. Second is to spend some of that additional money on integrated, layered ballistic missile defense systems. Third is to help our allies develop their own missile defense systems. And fourth is to reconsider and reevaluate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. First, let me turn to the threats that we face. First and most immediate, North Korea. As Secretary Jim Mattis said recently in testimony to Congress, North Korea is the most urgent and dangerous threat to peace and security that we face. This year alone, North Korea has been test firing 2 or 3 short and medium-range ballistic missiles per month. They're working on submarine-launched ballistic missile technology as well. Everyone agrees it's only a matter of time before the North Koreans can flight test an intercontinental missile capable of hitting not just Hawaii or Alaska, but the United States mainland. That's why President Obama warned President-elect Trump during the transition that North Korea was the most urgent crisis he might face. I should hasten to add that even if North Korea struggles to miniaturize its nuclear technology, their attack in the Kuala Lumpur airport reminded the world, too, that they have vast stores of chemical and biological weapons, which can also be delivered by missile technology. One also must worry about the reliability of North Korea's nuclear command and control systems. They are developing, for instance, road mobile and potentially submarine-launched ballistic missiles. One must wonder whether or not those commanders will be under the full control of North Korea's national leadership in a crisis. Second, Iran. Since the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed, Iran has tested ballistic missiles on at least 14 different occasions. The IRGC fired ballistic missiles into eastern Syria last week in an attempt to strike ISIS targets. I would suggest they were trying to send a signal to both the United States and Israel. Moreover, there are credible reports that Iran is supporting ballistic missile technology development in Yemen through their proxies, the Houthis. Finally, by the time Iran's nuclear deal requirements sunset, I would suggest they hope to have reliable delivery systems for any nuclear weapons program. Third, a country that sometimes escapes notice is Pakistan. One cannot discount the possibility that one of Pakistan's over 100 nuclear weapons might fall out of that government's control and potentially into the hands of extremists. And of course, a loose nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist group is exactly the kind of threat ballistic missile systems is designed to stop. Next is Russia. As everyone here is well aware, the Russians still maintain the world's largest inventory of nuclear warheads. Russia has also tested and deployed a ground-launched cruise missile that violates the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. General Silva, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified this year to Congress that the Russians have, quote, violated the spirit and intent of the INF Treaty, and they do not intend to return to compliance. He also said, quote, the system itself presents a risk to most of our facilities in Europe. In other words, Russia is violating a treaty from which they receive greater benefit to the United States and therefore need more without paying any consequences. China. The PLA Navy has fielded 4 SSBNs, giving Beijing a credible sea-based nuclear deterrent. China also is not a member to the INF Treaty. Therefore, they have developed a number of dual-use missile variants in the 500 to 5,500 kilometer range that contribute to their anti-access area denial strategy in East Asia. Moreover, both Russia and China are blurring the doctrinal separation between nuclear and conventional weapons use. Now, some may say that ballistic missile defenses are provocative to our adversaries because it could disturb the balance of deterrence. But I would say the balance is already being disturbed by these technological advances as well as these blurred doctrinal lines. Russia sees theater weapons and limited nuclear use against conventional military targets as a way to escalate to de-escalate in their terms, to end a conventional conflict on favorable terms for Russia. China, likewise, is beginning to rethink its no first use doctrine, which can occur, of course, at any point, up to the decision to use nuclear weapons in a crisis. And Chinese military journals discuss the use of nuclear weapons as a higher level component of the anti-access aerial denial strategy in the Western Pacific. With regard to China, I also must note that we have to deal with the fact that the size and the quality of its nuclear forces remain largely a mystery to us, as we have little transparency on what nuclear weapons they may have produced and whether and how they are concealed. Deterring what we don't know about, of course, is a very difficult task. If our adversaries are contemplating the use of nuclear forces as part of normal warfare, then I would suggest we'd be best advised to develop ballistic missile defenses instead of clinging to a deterrence framework that they have already discarded. So what ought we do about all these threats? Well, first, as I said, the most fundamental decision we have is increasing our defense budget. And with that comes the requirement of repealing the Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act was passed in 2011 in a very different world than we face now. Congress has repeatedly made it clear that they cannot abide by those limits. After spending caps went into effect briefly in 2013, Congress passed a 2-year budget, followed by an omnibus, followed by an omnibus. Congress did that again in 2015. If Congress does not act to repeal the Budget Control Act, I predict that we will see a continuing resolution in September, another 2-year budget in the fall, another omnibus this December, another omnibus in December 2018, and then we will repeat that cycle once again in the 2019-2020 phase. That will not save money because spending caps will increase, but it will also not mean wise investments because our military will not have the kind of long-term stability and predictability they need. Only 47 senators were in office in 2011 to vote for that bill. The 112th Congress was not the Constitutional Convention. The Budget Control Act is not the Constitution. The Budget Control Act must be repealed. How should we spend that money? We have a lot of needs, a lot of conventional needs, a lot of needs to modernize our nuclear forces. But the threats that we face also require that we accelerate the deployment of integrated and layered ballistic missile defense systems that incorporate forward-based assets with space sensors and ground-based interceptors in the United States and begin to explore airborne systems as well. In the short term, we need to be able to stop the limited ICBM attack threat from states like North Korea and potentially Iran. Over the long term, though, I would suggest that we need to be able to stop an attack from near-peer adversaries as well. So I was pleased to see the Missile Defense Agency's successful ground-based interceptor test last month that destroyed an incoming missile from the Pacific. We're now on track to have 44 ground-based interceptors deployed by the end of the year. To accelerate our ballistic missile defense progress, I've co-sponsored the Advancing American Missile Defense Act, along with Senators Sullivan, Cruz, Rubio, Capito, Manchin, Peters, and Schatz, a bipartisan group of senators who recognize the threats that we face, some of whom own citizens face it the most gravely. This legislation will authorize another 28 ground-based interceptors. It would accelerate the development and deployment of advanced interceptor technologies, as well as the development and deployment of a space-based sensor layer. It would also accelerate the environmental impact statement for our interceptor site on the East Coast, as well as one in the Midwest of the United States. And it would require a DoD report on the possibility of up to 100 ground-based interceptors distributed across the United States, and ask for the specifics about optimal locations and the possibilities of transportable ground-based interceptors. In addition, I think the Missile Defense Agency should rapidly develop and demonstrate an airborne unmanned aerial vehicle boost phase intercept capability. The concept here would involve high-altitude, long-endurance UAVs equipped with laser payloads, loitering for days at a time. UAV rotations would be managed by a ground crew. Why would we do this? Well, intercepting a missile in the boost phase before it achieves mid-course is, of course, the holy grail of ballistic missile defense, because the missile is moving slower, it's therefore easier to track, and it's still intact. No decoys or debris have deployed to complicate targeting the warhead. It also, of course, is over the enemy territory, not over our territory. All these things combined make it increase the probability of an intercept and the impact of an intercept. The concept is, of course, challenging, mainly due to technology. However, the technology is rapidly advancing, and I believe with more investment and exploration, it is a feasible concept. Third, we need to encourage our allies to deploy their own ballistic missile defense systems. 4 deployed U.S. missile defense systems and allied ballistic missile defense information sharing supports our goals of protecting the homeland, extended deterrence, and assurance of our allies. The United States has deployed 2 THAAD launchers to South Korea, but the new South Korean government has delayed the deployment of 4 additional THAAD systems in an attempt to appease China and their intimidation of South Korea. The Japanese are currently debating whether to deploy either the THAAD system or the Aegis Ashore system. We should encourage them, just as we should encourage our allies in the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates has already purchased the THAAD system. The United States has approved for sale to Qatar and Saudi Arabia THAAD systems as well, all to develop layered ballistic missile defense threats from Iran. In Europe, it has been 1 year since NATO deployed Aegis Ashore to Romania. Construction is also underway on a Polish Aegis Ashore site, and 4 Aegis-capable U.S. destroyers are currently based in Rota, Spain. All of these developments, plus more that could be on the way, will help develop or help create the kind of layered theater system that our troops and nationals, as well as our allies and their citizens, need. Fourth and final, I suggest it's time to reevaluate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. If Russia is going to test and deploy intermediate range cruise missiles, then logic dictates that we must respond. After all, as I said, Russia benefits more from the INF Treaty than does the United States, unless we believe that Canada or Mexico are going to develop intermediate range missiles anytime soon, or that we would allow them to be deployed to Cuba, none of which, I would imagine, would happen. Yet Russia is violating with impunity a treaty from which they benefit more than do we. It's obvious that pleading with Vladimir Putin's regime to uphold its treaty obligations has not brought Russia back into compliance, nor is it likely to do so. Therefore, strengthening our deterrent, and specifically our ballistic missile deterrent in Russia, very well might. The commander of Pacific Command, Harry Harris, recently testified that we should take a look at renegotiating the treaty because it has become, in his words, a unilateral limitation on us. Since the United States and Russia are the only 2 nations who are party to that treaty and Russia is violating it, the United States is the only country on Earth that is not at least exploring, if not developing, and actively deploying cruise and ballistic missiles in the range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. That's why I propose the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty Preservation Act, all aimed at taking steps that are permissible within the INF Treaty, but also to pressure Iran or Russia to come back into compliance. The legislation would establish a program of record for a dual-capable, road-mobile ground-launched missile system with INF ranges and facilitate the transfer of INF range systems to allied countries. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, under Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, the United States successfully used such dual-track approach to bring the Soviet Union to the INF negotiating table. The legislation would further limit funds on New START extension or Open Sky Treaty activities until Russia returns to compliance with the INF Treaty. These are just a few of the steps I think we should take to face the growing threat, or to counteract the growing threat that we face from our adversaries' missile technology and deployment advances. There's no doubt more that we could, but at this point I'm happy to turn to Harry for questions, and then to each of you.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Senator. Let me use moderator's privilege to ask the first question, then I'll open it up to the audience. Listening to your remarks, Senator, I kept thinking about North Korea. I mean, obviously very much in the news. There was rumors circulating on Friday and over the weekend that because over the weekend on the 25th, we had the anniversary of the North Korean, the war with North Korea in the 1950s, that there could be a nuclear test. So let's say, for example, North Korea were to test an ICBM. What do you think would be the appropriate response from the Trump administration? Do you think we should use our missile defenses and take it out? Would it be a better idea to observe it? What do you think would be the best approach?
Yes. So I won't speculate on hypotheticals, and I'll leave some of those questions to our military experts. But we should bring every pressure to bear we can on North Korea to deter them from doing just that. I have to say, I don't think China has done much in the last 6 months, or for that matter, the last 30 years in trying to deter this threat from North Korea. They continue to try to have it both ways, and there's much more that we could do in terms of sanctions against North Korea's illicit network, as well as businesses and individuals in China who's facilitating North Korea's military and their ballistic missile technology developments. That said, in the same time, we've got to continue to take prudent precautions, which is working with the new Moon administration in Seoul to hopefully deploy the remaining THAAD systems to encourage Japan to take whatever course they choose and deem most appropriate for their own self-defense and the defense of our soldiers and sailors and airmen and marine and theater, whether it's the THAAD system or the Aegis system. There are steps left to be taken that we have not yet taken with North Korea before we simply cede to the choice between accepting North Korea as a nuclear-armed state that can hold at risk the states of the United States of America, or having to fight another Korean War.
Okay, fair enough. Well, with that, it is question and answer time. So please keep in mind to state your affiliation when you ask your question. We'll open it up. You were first, ma'am, please. If we can get a microphone there, that'd be great. Right behind you.
Thank you very much. Katrina Manson from the Financial Times. Thanks for having me. I wanted to ask the basis for your aim to have 100 interceptors, and what you make of the risk of so many of the current interceptors deployed being first and second generation, which have been shown to have technical problems.
Well, I think we need more interceptors. Obviously, if North Korea develops a intercontinental missile, or if there's another missile threat to our homeland, you don't want to have one interceptor for one missile. The success rate is growing, but the success rate is unlikely to ever be perfect or 100%. And therefore, we need to increase the number of interceptors we have. In terms of the technology, obviously, as I said, I was pleased to see the successful test earlier this month over the Pacific. Of course, the question to ask on these tests is not whether it was a success or a failure, but what we learned, because you learn from success or from failure. If we're succeeding with first or second generation interceptors, that's a good thing, but it also leads to more lessons learned that might create future generation as well.
Richard, please. Wait for a microphone, Richard, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Richard White, Senior Fellow, Hudson Institute. Following that, I would think that one way you could make the best use of any additional interceptors, as well as the existing ones, is improving the kill vehicle. Now, you laid out some long-term objectives, but it might be useful to think about having the redesigned kill vehicle, at least as an interim step towards that process.
I would agree.
We had some other, go ahead, please. We can get her a mic right over there. Thank you.
Hi, Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. You spoke earlier about Russia and China blurring the lines between conventional and nuclear weapons use. What does that have any impact on your thoughts on whether the U.S. should develop the new LRSO, which critics have worried will also confuse the two?
No, of course we need to develop the new long-range standoff cruise missile. Our current Alcoms air-launched cruise missiles are soon to be reaching their shelf life. We are developing a new B-21 bomber, but I think it would be unwise to assume that throughout the multi-decade life of that aircraft, that it's always going to be able to evade the most complex air defenses and reach the interior of our country, of our adversaries' territories. In addition, the B-52, with the right kind of modernization, can be deployed for many decades to come. Obviously, the B-52 cannot penetrate the air defense systems of our adversaries, and a new long-range standoff cruise missile is essential for making the B-52 a viable part of our nuclear triad. That's why almost every flag officer who's testified from the Armed Services Committee has said that the long-range standoff cruise missile is a vital part of our nuclear triad, in addition to the B-21 and the Ohio-class replacement and the ground-based strategic deterrent.
Jacob Halbert.
Jacob Halbrand, the National Interest. Thanks for coming, Senator.
Thank you. Snappi suit.
I had a broader question for you in listening to your remarks is, what country do you think poses overall the greatest threat to American security right now?
Well, it's a good question, but the answer to that question always is something like asking how many adversaries can dance on the head of a pin, because all of our adversaries pose serious threats. So as the most immediate threat, you might say North Korea, you might say Iran, or some of the terror networks that a country like Iran supports, or a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. Those are all reasonable answers to your question. At the same time, Russia is a very reasonable answer to your question, because Russia, at this point, absent massive strategic surprise from China, is the only country that has the nuclear arsenal capable of destroying our way of life. And Russia, over the last several years, has made it clear that they remain a hostile power, and that Vladimir Putin doesn't think the Soviet Union or Russia lost the Cold War. They were simply behind at halftime and are working quickly to make up the difference. So much so that you might ask today whether Russia is better poised to get to France or get to Spain than they were in the late stage of the Cold War. So there's different ways of looking at that question. The takeaway, though, from the fact that I think it's hard to pinpoint a single threat that is the gravest threat we face, is that our military needs to be agile and flexible and dominant in every domain and region. And part of that dominance is missile defense, not just to protect our deployed troops, but as I said at the outset, to protect the U.S. homeland, which is the most basic premise of American strategy.
Christina Wong.
Hi. Hi, Senator. Good to see you. Two areas, North Korea and the INF. On North Korea, do you think it's time to give up on China? China's trying to get China to help with North Korea. What more pressure can be applied? What do you make of the president's tweet on China? How do you think the administration is handling it so far? And on the INF, would leaving the INF spark a new arms race? Thank you.
It's better to win an arms race than lose a war. So that's really in the hands of Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership. They're the ones that are violating the INF Treaty. They're the ones that have deployed a road mobile intermediate-range cruise missile that is extremely destabilizing in Europe and potentially in the Middle East and East Asia as well. My legislation is designed to bring Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty. Again, Russia needs the INF Treaty more than we need them. One reason they came to the negotiating table is that once we deployed intermediate range missiles to Europe in 1983 on a policy that started under the Carter administration and was continued under the Reagan administration, they recognized just how grave the threat was to them. Again, the United States faces a much more limited threat from intermediate range missiles. Russia also gets much more from the Open Skies Treaty than does the United States, yet Russia continues to violate the Open Skies Treaty. And Russia is likely to want to extend the New START Treaty. We have many points of pressure that we can bring to bear on Russia to get them back into compliance with the INF Treaty. Now, even if we do get them back into compliance, of course, we still face the reality that China, since it's not a party to the treaty, has something north of 90% of all of its missiles in that intermediate range, as Admiral Harris pointed out to the Armed Services Committee recently. But I think at a minimum, we have to take the steps necessary to bring Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty. First question on North Korea. I don't think it's time to abandon yet the effort to try to encourage Beijing to bring more pressure to bear on Pyongyang. There are steps that we have not yet taken that we can take. For instance, the threat of secondary sanctions against Chinese businesses, institutions, and individuals who are key facilitators for North Korea. There are also direct steps that we can take about North Korea, like relisting them as a state sponsor of terrorism, or cracking down again on some of their financial institutions, like we did in the last decade against Bank of Delta Asia, but in a misguided effort to try to reach a negotiated outcome with North Korea, we lifted those things. So I commend President Trump and Secretary of State Tillerson for undertaking these efforts with China. I don't think they've yielded fruit yet, but I think they're worth pursuing further.
Right behind Christina. Mike's coming right behind you.
Hi, Senator. I'm Elizabeth from Congressman Jim Banks' office. It's wonderful to see you here today.
Say hi to Jim for me.
I will. I have a question about NATO. There's been, even in the past 6 months, and as Montenegro was just voted in, questions of its usefulness and effectiveness. Even today, it's been called a Cold War relic. But we've seen them actually step up exercises and involvement over the next few months in response to Russia. So with Congress kind of playing on the side of NATO, and the administration has questioned it, as the president's talked about, the GDP, the 2%. What are your thoughts on the usefulness for NATO and how we could see our involvement and encouragement to our allies, especially in Eastern Europe, just grow over the next 6 months?
No, NATO is still vital to our national security. As I said at the outset, a fundamental premise of American grand strategy since before we were a country is the defense of our homeland and our citizens. And every citizen in all 50 states deserve, under our Constitution, equal protection from those kinds of threats. And we have all those bases, not just in Europe, but in the Middle East and in East Asia, and the entire Eurasian rimland, in part to forward defend. So our military plays road games. They don't play home games here on U.S. soil. Many of the countries in NATO are relatively small, and they're not wealthy countries. They're not going to contribute, 10 divisions to our military efforts. However, they are vital things they can contribute through their geopolitical position and through accesses or insights that they may have. That's one reason why we have NATO and we have all those bases overseas. President Trump is very right that our NATO allies, though, need to spend the amount of money that we all pledged to each other a few years ago, and that too many have not been doing. The most important countries are the larger, richer ones, like Germany. It'd be nice if the smaller, poorer countries in NATO spend enough to meet that commitment as well. But again, if you're a country of a couple million people and a relatively limited economy, you're not going to field 10 mechanized divisions. The larger countries, though, can make a real difference. And ultimately, deterrence is not about uttering magic words. It's not a political matter. Deterrence is a military matter. And Vladimir Putin knows, just like aggressors always know, that no words backed up or not backed up by action mean anything. So it would be a much greater deterrent if NATO spent the $100 to $120 billion every year that it hasn't been spending because our European allies are not matching their commitments than anything that any national leader could say.
I think we had Marvin Ott and then Dave Majumdar.
Thank you, Senator. Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, now Johns Hopkins and the Wilson Center. I'd like to probe your knowledge of the technology on the missile defense side, based on, you have privileged access to a world that I once worked in but no longer do. And the prelude to that is, I take your point that there are still screws to be turned potentially on pressure on North Korea. But we've been at this for well over 20 years. We've tried a variety of approaches. We've been trying to use sanctions as a route to bring the North Koreans around for a very long time. It gives grounds for someone like me to be ultimately pessimistic that that's going to be a viable route. And what you're left with then, I think, is your topic, which is missile defense. And I wonder if you can say anything about, the technical challenges in this world are huge. The complexities are mind-numbing. How good are we, and how good can we get?
So first, on the geopolitical point about North Korea, as I mentioned earlier, I think there are steps that can be taken that have not yet been taken to bring pressure to bear on North Korea. China made a show earlier this year of cutting off coal imports, which didn't really have much impact. North Korea gets refined petroleum products, though, almost exclusively from China. If China stopped sending those, you would see basically, within a matter of weeks, North Korea would probably be entirely out of gasoline, just to give you one example. So I do think there are geopolitical steps we can take that we haven't yet taken, and that we ought to take if China doesn't quit playing both sides in this rivalry. In terms of military technology, I obviously can't go into great detail, and you're right that it is very complex. I also caveat that I'm not a rocket scientist, and I barely got through physics in school. However, the experts who do this work at the Missile Defense Agency and more broadly within the Pentagon or outside experts are increasingly confident that with higher levels of investment and more focused leadership in the executive branch and interest and pushing from the Congress, that we are on the cusp of some pretty major breakthroughs, not just in ground-based interceptors, as I mentioned, but for instance in airborne laser interceptors. Again, it's very cutting-edge stuff, but given the pace of technological innovation, especially in this country, I believe that sooner rather than later we could see a genuine and acknowledged effective layered missile defense system that could largely, if not entirely, neutralize the threat from a country like North Korea.
We've got Dave Majumdar next. We can get him a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, David Turner. I'm the Defense Center for the National Interest. So you mentioned you want to eventually build this thing into something that can defend against a peer-level threat, which would mean Russia or China. What kind of investment do you see that would take in order to achieve that? Because, 100 interceptors is not going to do a lot against the Russian arsenal. You're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of interceptors and no guarantee of success. It almost invites a kind of situation where they might be, even if they perceived a threat, to launch for a strike if we were going to do some of that. And the second point was also with the INF Treaty, the Europeans are still threatened by Russian ground-based cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in that case. We may not be threatened, but they are. That's kind of a problem because we may not have that skin in the game, but they do. So, what can we do to reassure our NATO allies that we're going to do something to defend them in that sort of situation?
So your first question, you're right that it would be a large investment of resources. That's one reason why I say the Budget Control Act must be repealed, among many other reasons. But we won't know until we continue the technological development. Again, with the pace of technological innovation in this country, with the possibility of advanced space-based systems, I do believe that we can one day get to a layered system that would make the United States homeland protected against these kind of threats. It's going to be longer than it would take to get to North Korea, as we were just talking about, but I do think it's technologically feasible. I don't want to get into more details, though, about the kind of cost estimates I've seen. Second, on the INF Treaty, of course Europeans are threatened by intermediate range missiles for the same reason that Europe is. That's why Europeans should support our efforts to try to bring Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty. Those missiles are being driven around Russia right now, and they could strike any European capital with virtually no warning. So European countries, rather than suggesting that we look the other way or bury our head in the sand or try to talk more and take no action, should be supporting the kind of legislation that I have, which is designed within the current parameters of the INF Treaty to put pressure on Russia to come back into compliance.
All right, we have time for maybe one brief question, if possible. Please. Microphone's coming for you, sir.
Senator, that was a fine presentation, and from a Cold War military guy, and all those increases in our nation's military capability, it warms my heart. But I'm also a guy that balances his checkbook every month. I know that's a quaint concept in modern government, but with somewhere in the neighborhood of a $20 trillion national debt and entitlement spending on upward vectors with 10,000 boomers adding to those roles on a daily basis, how are you going to pay for all of that?
Just for the record, our chairman, Chuck Boyd, everybody.
General, it's a very good question. And then it goes far beyond the topic we're addressing here on ballistic missile defense. I would say, though, as a general matter, our defense budget is not the cause of our deficits or the cause of that $20 trillion in debt. And if anything, it helps make that deficit and that debt more manageable in the long term because it keeps open international lanes of commerce and keeps our people and our assets protected. Inevitably, when we tried to balance the budget on the back of the military, as we did immediately following the demise of the Soviet Union, as we did over the last 8 years, our enemies catch up with it as they did to us on 9/11, or as you're seeing around the world now, and we end up spending even more money than we would have, often on a crash course, often on things that we wouldn't have had to spend them on had we simply maintained higher steady state operations. Further, on our strategic forces, I have sometimes heard the objection that we shouldn't spend so much money on weapons that we never use. I would dispute both premises of that statement. One, we don't spend that much money on our strategic forces. It's only about 3 or 4% of the total defense budget. And two, we use our nuclear forces every single day, and we have for 73 years because they help deter that existential threat to our homeland. But your point is very right about the need to get our fiscal house in order. The most immediate and fundamental thing we can do is get our economy growing once again at a rate that's much higher than 1.5% to 2% that it has been. President Trump obviously has prioritized that through regulatory action, but Congress is working on it as well. We're looking at healthcare legislation this week that might have the impact of making Medicaid, for instance, one of the 3 big drivers of our national debt, more financially stable in the long term while delivering an equal or greater quality of care to the most vulnerable populations that have needed it since its inception. But you're right about the challenges that we face from our debt. I would just say that our military, so far from being a cause of that debt, is actually something that helps keep it within manageable levels by protecting peace and prosperity, not just here in the United States, but around the world.
All right, well, that concludes part one. If we can get a hand for Senator Cotton. Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it for doing it.
So if we could have Joe and Rebecca come join us, we'll